The webinar we're doing today actually is going to look at trade agreements. We're now in negotiations to leave the European Union, and that means we're going to try to negotiate a trade deal with them. We'll also be trying to negotiate a whole series of trade deals with other countries once we have left the European Union. And of course, there was one big deal that was being discussed called TTIP, and that deal was one that Linda Kauscher, who you see here, just click to her, there she is. Linda was very critical of, as many people were, because of the impact it had on our democracy, on accountability, on the power of corporations and so on. Now, Linda believes that it's not just TTIP, it's a problem. Lots of trade deals have those sort of restrictions. And as we go into negotiating trade deals, we're going to have to be very careful. We're going to have to be very vigilant. We're going to have to scrutinize what happens, or else we're going to find ourselves not free of the restrictions that TTIP had, but still in them. So I'm going to hand over to Linda now to talk. We've got Fong with us as well. Fong's going to help me with the questions later. Fong often does that, and that's great. But I'm going to go to Linda very soon. But before I do, let me say, please type any comments you've got or any questions you've got as Linda's speaking in the right-hand column. If you haven't got the chat box up yet, you can put your cursor at the bottom of the screen and it says chat. You click on that and a chat box comes up. And if you type in there, you can see there's already things in there. Peter Feltham has already typed in there, so please feel free to type in and that will be great. Anyhow, Linda, thank you for doing this, and I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thank you. I want to make it very clear that I'll be talking about what passes for trade deals and not about trade. So, despite divisions among us, we're all now up against the corporate takeover of the world. And as corporations become bigger, more powerful, dominate governments' agendas, for instance, in lowering regulations, governments in turns are colluding in trade deals that lock in corporate power. So international trade deals are a key element of this global corporate takeover. And though the trade agreement process is government to government, they are actually a class issue in which there's a strengthening and literally a legitimizing of the power of transnational capital over the interests of the rest of us and over our democracy. So while the media focuses on tariffs on goods, these deals are mostly about transnational investors getting unfettered access into their trade partners' services markets and fixing that access irreversibly into international law. And that's reinforced by investor-state dispute settlement, ISDS, allowing transnational corporations to sue governments for any regulation that negatively affects their future corporate profits. So with Brexit, the international trade agreements, including the one that we have with the EU, will frame our future. Not just in the access and tariffs that are being discussed, but also in the embedding of corporate power, which is not being discussed. What I'm going to be talking about is the most dangerous aspects of trade deals and what's happening with those. The EU's trade deals and us, the UK Brexit trade deals and some implications of those, and the UK trade deal environment. So the elements of trade deals that have been identified as most dangerous are investor-to-state dispute settlement, regulatory harmonisation with its potential effects on standards such as health and safety, and the interplay between these. So what's happening with these? ISDS was adjusted for the Canada agreement to a different form, the investment court system, but not very different. Now the EU is proposing a multilateral investment court to overcome the objections, even though it still is ISDS anyway, but also to institutionalize and embed ISDS much more deeply than in the current ad hoc tribunals. So the EU seemingly is determined to take forward this proposal, though it will need to be accepted, for instance, by the US. By the way, ISDS cases are now a thriving investment opportunity. Investors are taking the cases forward on behalf of corporations and then sharing the rewards. The rewards are the payouts of government money. Harmonising standards is happening now in other agreements outside of trade deals. For instance, there's now an EU-US pharmaceutical agreement and a 1998 EU-US manufacturing standards agreement has been recently updated. These agreements are likely to limit regulation. So the point that I'm making here is that both ISDS and regulatory harmonisation, these most dangerous aspects of the trade deals, are now being developed outside of the individual trade deals too. So to talk about the EU's trade deals and us, the EU will be in any the UK will be in any EU deals that are at least provisionally implemented before we actually leave the EU. So if they're provisionally implemented, we'll be in for 3 years or for 20 years if they've been fully ratified. The Canada-EU deal, CETA, will be provisionally implemented possibly at the beginning of June, though it will not be, the ISDS aspect will not be provisionally implemented. So currently 35 member state parliaments, national and subnational, need to ratify it. Any of them can veto it. Some states have started the process. The process may take up to 5 years. The Walloon Parliament seems to be waiting to see what the ISDS in CETA looks like. The Belgium government undertook to request a European Court of Justice opinion on the compatibility of the CETA version of ISDS with the EU treaties to satisfy Wallonia that was standing out against it. I understand they're still preparing that request, that it hasn't gone in yet. Which means that if it goes in, it will be after the agreement is provisionally implemented. The Catalonian government has very recently asked the central Spanish government to suspend CETA for ratification. So we have to see what happens with this. On the Canadian side, there are some issues for those who will lose out, but will probably be sorted out with compensation. Apparently, according to the Commission, some tweaking of CETA is still possible at this stage. The Singapore agreement, which is negotiations are finalised, awaiting a European Court of Justice decision on the mixity, on who has real responsibility. This the judgment's expected on May the 16th, next week. Will be significant for this and for future deals, because if it's judged that it's just Commission responsibility, that means no member state ratification is necessary, no provisional implementation, deals will go straight into force. Other EU deals that are on the go, with Vietnam and Japan, both seem to be near completion. Negotiations with Mercosur, renewed agreements with Mexico and Chile, investment agreements with China and Myanmar, initial talks with Australia and New Zealand. The EU is also still pursuing economic partnership agreements with developing regions, but there's resistance to these, so they're at a standstill. So UK involvement will be at least with CETA, with Canada, probably with Singapore, possibly Vietnam and Japan. TTIP is supposedly in the deep freezer, but is very reliant on the whims of Trump, who gave recent positive indications about the deal. There's some general developments within the EU in relation to trade deals that I draw your attention to. It's possible that the anti-TTIP feeling may be fueling anti-EU feeling, which makes it a negative for EU institutions. The Trade Commissioner now wants to avoid trade acronyms like TTIP as she says, they become toxic, which means that we get to use them. And so, for instance, we'll be likely to dump the TTIP acronym if talks resume with the US. And thirdly, the EU is proposing cutting funding to any NGOs that have objectives contrary to the values of the EU, including its commercial objectives, which would be its trade deals. To talk about the potential UK Brexit trade deals and some implications of some of those. The UK cannot negotiate trade deals before leaving the EU, but in late 2016 and early this year, Theresa May and some key ministers were in a flurry of visits with India, the US, China, Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, Norway, Australia, New Zealand, Turkey, and Israel. It may have been largely for show, but it was about talking up the possibilities of trade deals. And every time there were references to consulting with stakeholders, possibly some lessons learned there, at least as far as the show goes. But the Department of International Trade has set up working groups with its opposite numbers in all of these countries. Some implications of 3 of these deals. A US-UK deal. It's likely that this would follow, logically, it was likely that this would follow the pattern of what was proposed for TTIP, because, for instance, tariffs were quite sorted out in TTIP. From the US side, the biggest TTIP lobby was US agribusiness, trying to get US food products into the EU. So unless there is resistance, the threat of cheap industrialized US agricultural products would potentially devastate farming here. From the UK side, in an agreement with the US, the Secretary for State for Trade wants banks' rights prioritized. But I think we should also consider Trump's commitment to renegotiating NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada and Mexico, because it's possible that we could get pulled into an expanded NAFTA, a North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, which would be possible without even changing the acronym. The possibility of a UK-India Free Trade Agreement. If there were, the main factor for India would be the supply of cheap temporary labour. This is called Mode 4 in trade agreements. This is always the Indian priority. In the UK, that would be disguised by language about high skills that we need. In the EU, they just call it sensitive so that no one mentions it. In 2013, the TUC here voted unanimously to oppose an EU-India free trade agreement because of the effects on Indian people and because of the Mode 4 effects here, the labour effects here. That motion could come in useful in resisting a UK-India trade deal. UK and China. This would be likely to be a bilateral investment treaty a bit, as the EU has been pursuing with China. With a bit, there is no requirement on human rights, labour, environment, or any of that stuff. Already there is encouragement for mechanisms to, for Chinese investment into the UK and for British investment access into China. For me, this two-way investment raises some obvious questions. Adam Smith's claims for the benefits of free trade, which is the reference point for neoliberalism, include the invisible hand of what he calls home bias. That's his assumption that investors will prefer to invest in their own country. But clearly that sort of constraining balancing factor no longer exists. My instinct is that Chinese investors will have few concerns for the effects of their investment on people here, and similarly British investors for effects on Chinese people. Also, ISDS in a bilateral investment treaty with China could be very costly for the UK. So to talk about the UK Brexit trade deal environment, some aspects of the situation here. Because of our Parliament's own procedures, the UK Parliament has no veto over EU trade deals. Swansea Labour MP Geraint Davis proposed a bill for parliamentary debate and for parliamentary power to refuse and or change trade agreements. It had a first reading in 2016, but is now fallen with the dissolution of Parliament for the election. Our Secretary of State for International Trade, Liam Fox, has been the UK bridge for a very powerful US big business organisation that pushes through deregulation in the US. And the UK trade representative in the US, Antonia Romeo, is also on the board of British American Business. Another point is that the City of London will dominate any moves on trade negotiating here, and perhaps it's worth noting that Theresa May's husband is a senior executive at a $1.4 trillion investment fund with stakes in JP Morgan and in Lockheed, which is bidding for a £1 billion NHS contract. The current thrust of any UK political and media attention to prospective Brexit trade deals is about grabbing at any trade deal opportunity, regardless of what it might entail. And this rather crass view might be exacerbated further if a competitive trade deal environment develops between the EU and the UK. I can envisage that happening. The Labour MP Barry Gardiner did initiate a just trading community focused on benefits for small and medium enterprise from any trade deals. But I haven't heard about that any more about that since it was initiated. So to finish, some ideas from me about what's needed: a network of committed people watching, discussing, and prepared to act, including to challenge the media's trade deals at any price rhetoric. We need to formulate some definitive red lines for all UK trade deals to which groups and institutions can sign up their support so that that support is visible. We need to educate on the real nature of trade deals, especially services, trade in services. And this Davis bill needs to be represented to a new parliament. So I look forward to hearing your ideas.
You didn't use your PowerPoint at all. You didn't want to do that. Okay, you did it quite well.
Someone else's computer, and it's tricky.
No, sometimes it's even better without PowerPoint. So you know that's great. Okay, everyone, you've heard what Linda said, and she's given a fairly, I think, strong description of what the environment is and what is likely to happen and the difficulties in the future that we might face in terms of negotiating trade deals and the impact it might have on us. So please, if you have any comments or if you have any questions, please type them in and we'll put them to Linda. And Fong, obviously, you look for those. And if you have any questions yourself, please ask them. But I guess I'll start the ball rolling while we're waiting. I mean, you've described trade deals and all the problems and the restrictions and the power of corporations. But could you give us some examples, just to give it some real life, of how it could adversely affect the everyday life of citizens in this country in terms of the services that are delivered and the products that are delivered that we have no control over scrutinizing at all?
Well, it's a very strong push to lower regulations. And the usual pattern with trade agreements is that the lowering of regulations, we've seen it in the EU, we've seen it in India when the EU-India agreement was being negotiated. Whatever the demands are, it takes place as a domestic policy change. So it doesn't look like it's part of the agreement a lot of the time. So it's happened with the pressure on on the regulations and the weakening of regulations in the EU on endocrine disrupting chemicals, for instance. But it didn't. It was lobbying by the US, but it didn't look like it was part of a trade agreement. So that's what we could expect is a lowering of regulations, seemingly like it's a domestic policy decision, but actually in preparation for a trade agreement. So that could be sort of health and safety stuff lowered.
I mean, so for example, I mean, if you can give some concrete examples, I mean, you talked about food and the agro business being a very dominant factor in this. I mean, if we were to import American meat, for example, they might have hormones in them that we normally wouldn't want. We may have genetically modified food that we might not want. Is that the sort of thing that you're talking about? Is that the sort of thing that we might, in fact, be faced with if we don't have the right controls that we want?
Yes, but like I say, you wouldn't be faced with, oh, the US wants to bring in GM food. There'd be a debate in this country, or, oh, maybe GM's okay and that, and the regulation would be lowered in preparation for that entry. Food in the US is much cheaper, so you can see, but it's very much industrialized food. You know, I mean, they wash chickens in chlorine because of the conditions that the poultry is kept in. So the standards are much lower. The food's cheaper. So you'd have much lower standard food coming in, but it would be cheap. So in that sense, it would be likely to sweep the market and knock out farmers here, because farmers here and in the rest of the EU indeed have to meet much higher standards. So the food is more expensive. So that's why you'd knock out your farming sector.
So it's examples like that really that brings home to people what the consequences of not changing the environment on trade negotiations would be. So, I mean, I think that's really valuable. Fong, do you want to take up? I gather there's one or two questions that have come up.
Yeah, Christopher, he's asking about the period, the provisional period with the NAFTA or the deal with US. When would it start?
I'm not saying that we would be in NAFTA, but I think we can look at a possibility of that, because if the two things were being, we can't start any negotiations for 2 years. Trump has a big electoral commitment to reform it, as he calls, reform NAFTA or make changes in NAFTA, but he's in no hurry to do it. So you can see that they could be coming together around the same time. And I'm just suggesting the possibility that that they could become one and the same. That they could, but there's no, I mean, the time frame for us is that we don't start formal negotiations on anything until after 2 years.
I mean, do you think that because we've left the EU and we're sort of on our own, we might start looking for new alliances like NAFTA? In other words, we'll leave the EU, but we'll go into other collaborative arrangements which will have the same sort of restrictions. And is that a problem we have to watch out for and that we might have to face?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at statements from Liam Fox, they're falling over themselves to be in a deal with the US.
Okay. I mean, I think a lot of people would find that incredibly surprising that we will be landing in NAFTA. And I think that would
I'm just putting it out as a possibility. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I'm saying that the two things would be possibly being negotiated around the same time. So I can see that possibility arising.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I mean. It's not inconceivable, is it? I mean, it's possible that that would happen. Yes. As we move out of the EU, we're looking for new trade alliances. And as you said in your presentation, you know, we'll be desperate to have them, that we might go in at very bad terms. and that's the real problem. So how can we watch out? What can we do to try and prevent that sort of occurrence happening?
I think before this election, there's no chance of that. I don't think any party is going to be critiquing trade agreements at the moment, and it's not going to happen formally. Although, as I said, there are these working groups set up with a whole range of countries already from the Department of International Trade with their opposite numbers in those countries. But nothing's going to happen formally for while we're still in the EU. So there's that sort of time stretch in front of us. But I think that a very solid thing to do is to have a list of things that we will not have in trade, that are red lines, that are not acceptable in trade agreements. Because that would be, that's then in one form. Whereas if you're trying to address a lot of different trade agreements, that's off in a lot of directions. But if you have your red lines of what's not acceptable, that can be in one definitive form. And there's a possibility, if you were campaigning on this, to have institutions and organisations sign up to that, so that the support for those red lines was visible, publicly visible.
Okay, Fong, I gather there's another couple of questions.
Yes, there is another question from Michelle asking, what do we have of legal resources to protect our organisation or UK citizens against the content of the trade deal with other countries?
Legal protections, legal resources that we have as citizens.
Yeah, or organisation.
Much less than you would expect in the Parliament, because when the European Scrutiny Committee was demanding a parliamentary debate on CETA, all it got was like an ad hoc committee, not even a standard committee of the Parliament. An ad hoc committee discussed it and gave the MPs a tick box for it, with huge documents to read. So no debate and no chance to oppose it. So it actually means our democracy is much weaker than you think. That bill was a very good move, because in putting that bill forward to demand debate and the power to change or block trade agreements, it really highlighted the fact that we don't have that in the current situation.
So you are saying we don't have many resources?
I mean, we've got to make them. We've got to make them from the ground up, really. I'm saying that the democracy is, the parliamentary democracy on these issues is very weak. But I guess Brexit, I think we need to look for positives, and I think Brexit is an opportunity to say that's not good enough, that we need that we want changes in those regards.
So, sorry.
No, go ahead.
So is it part of the agenda of what Theresa May is going to do? Do you know?
What is?
The legal part of it.
I don't think there will be any move for more democracy unless we demand it.
When you say we demand it, I mean, one of the problems we've got is that trade deals doesn't sound very sexy, does it? And
tell me about it.
I know. I mean, we're about to do some interviews of candidates on Facebook Live in 3 constituencies in North London, and we're doing it with another Facebook group that's local, and it's got a huge number of people. And they did a survey poll of the issues that people are interested in, and knife crime, police resources, education cuts, social care, Brexit, but not talking about trade deals. No one really gets worked up about trade deals. So how do we get the momentum behind the sort of opposition that we need in order to achieve the sort of scrutiny and change you want. I mean, it's a really uphill struggle, isn't it?
And at the moment, there's nothing there. There's nothing there to oppose at the moment. So, well, there's the EU stuff, but that's because of our current structure. We have to look to what the other member states will do on that. So, for the Brexit deals, there is nothing there to oppose at the moment, and this is why I suggested that we need the red lines of what we won't have, and to have a committed network of people that are watching what's happening, because you have to look for signs. I mean, you have to look to see that that Liam Fox has indicated that banks' needs should be prioritised in. You have to be looking for this stuff all the time. You want to know what action you can take. Well, and to make it more sexy, I think any opportunity to question the media's very superficial attitude, because the way the media are approaching this, the interviews I hear with politicians are just like, what trade deals can you get? How can you get a trade deal? So it's a real push in that direction. There's never anything anything critical or any attention to the content of trade deals. So I guess it's up to people to hassle the media about this when you hear things. I'm sorry I can't give you some magic bullet that will change everything. But like I say, at the moment, there's nothing there to change, but you can see how watchful we need to be. And what the pattern is from the ones that have been negotiated in the last few years, the pattern, how dangerous they are.
Yeah, sure, I understand that. But, you say we need to get a group of committed people together, and I'm sure that's right. But what interests me is how committed you are. I mean, you obviously have taken a topic which, as we said, isn't sexy. You're very passionate about it. I mean, what's made you so passionate about it? What's made you committed to sort of campaign in this area? It's one that not many people would have had the same sort of depth of passion and persistence that you've had.
I guess I realised that it is the big picture, and that a lot of the stuff that people work on, that this is the umbrella for it, that this decides the direction in which thing goes. The trade agreements really matter. So for all the people working on climate change, the trade deals and the rights that they give to corporations make a really big difference to what happens with climate change action, and what countries or states do on climate change can be very much limited by trade agreements. I just realised that they are the big picture.
So if you campaign on climate change, if you campaign about genetically modified foods, and you don't take account of all these things that are happening in the background on trade deals, you may end up defeating your own cause. Is that what has led you to the commitments you have?
Yes. So most issues will be affected by trade agreements.
Okay. And we've got some more questions coming up, Fong.
Yes, sorry, I have to come back because I read it wrong. I said resources, but it was not that it was meant reverse. It was more about the opportunities and strengths that could help us in our negotiation. I don't know whether you have more comment to it or not, but I have also other questions for you.
I mean,
you want me to follow up on that?
It's up to you. If there is not much to say, then I can jump to the next question. Sorry.
Yeah, let's move on. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
There is a question about the climate deal and the standard of future deal. How are they tied together?
Sorry, what's tied together?
Climate deal in Paris.
Right.
And the standards regarding to our future trade deal. How do they work together?
Yeah, I saw that's sort of interesting because you said that climate change is affected by trade deals, and I suppose what that question is, when you have a big agreement like Paris, and you have a big trade deal, do they ever sort of talk to each other, or do these happen independently?
I'm not really up on the trade I didn't follow the Paris stuff closely, but ISDS, the Investor State Dispute Settlement, is a massive area where any regulatory change can be challenged by corporations taking a case against the government for regulatory change that disadvantages their corporate profits. So this is why ISDS is such a big deal. It in fact is like the end of the development of regulation. So obviously a lot of the things that we want to happen are the sorts of things that will be challenged under ISDS. The stuff that people want, the social stuff, the environment, it's just the stuff that corporations are likely to challenge governments on if they increase regulation, if they change regulation.
Okay.
So that's a big area for it.
Yeah, okay. Michelle says that she sees that the organization Global Justice is now looking at trade deals as being important and considering them. And she's asking, in your knowledge, are there any other organizations that are taking up this campaign and understand what they mean?
In this country, the two NGOs that have worked on trade for the last few years have been Global Justice Now and War on Want.
What about organizations like the Fair Trade campaign? Do they ever think of trade deals, or are they too focused on what they're doing?
Fair trade in the terms of an organization like that is a pretty different ballgame. It's outside of trade agreements. Yeah, it's much more people-to-people stuff, isn't it? Yeah.
Okay. We'll keep bringing your questions through, won't you? I mean, the other thing, I mean, I was listening clearly to what you said. I suppose when you negotiate a trade deal, it's not going to happen as you want it anyhow. To some extent, it reflects the facts of life. I mean, you mentioned the India deal that we might have. If we had a trade deal with India, they're going to want to protect their students coming to this country. They're going to want to protect cheap labor maybe coming to this country. And they're going to say either you accept those things or there's no deal. Now, if one of our red lines is say we don't accept that, okay, we've kept our morals, but we've lost our trade and we've lost our wealth. I mean, how do you respond to that sort of argument?
I think it's worth remembering that the trade deals are primarily for transnational corporations. That's the beneficiaries of them. So it's easy to get caught up in the rhetoric that's in the politics and the media that we really need this deal and that, but we need to look at what's actually in the deal for us and what trade-offs are there, and not just grab at the idea of trade agreements. For instance, with the Canada-EU deal, we realised quite a long time ago that the supposed gains in the Canada deal are minute, and over 10 years they're still minute. And there's been a budgetary assessment just in the last couple of weeks from the Canadian side, budgetary assessment of the Canada deal there, and the gains are very, very small. So just the magic word trade deal does not mean great gains for all of us, though it probably means some pretty big gains for some transnational corporations. So there needs to be much more of a real critical look at what's in agreements. So, I mean, the massive CETA document, for instance, will have been read by very few of the people who are saying, give it a go ahead.
But some trade deals will also try to satisfy a lobby as well, won't they? Not just big, powerful organizations. I couldn't see, for example, France engaging in a trade deal that didn't protect its agricultural workers and its agricultural farmers. So it's not necessarily the big corporations, it's a lobby that has a lot of power.
The main agricultural lobby in France is the big agricultural companies. The small people, for instance, have not been getting the CAP money. Certainly, the small farmers who were objecting to the trade agreements. I think you have to, just to say like the name of a country, you have to look at the strata within a country and who benefits in the which strata of the country benefit. I mean, for us to go into a trade agreement that prioritizes the needs of banks, is that really what we all want? To come back to the Indian agreement, my sort of experience of that is that the EU-India free trade agreement that was negotiated for quite a few years, about 7 years, I think, but it's never come to fruition. But the EU wants to get it going again. But all the attention in that agreement, especially from NGOs, European NGOs, was the negative effects on Indian people, which were very broad and very significant. But I found out from a trade lawyer in the Commission. I finally got him to tell me what India was asking for, and that whole half of the agreement was for the entry of cheap labour into the EU, and then some further documentation someone passed to me showed it was mostly the UK. So it's significant, and it's without numerical limits. So we would need to know about this, but like I say, these things will be covered up in the language, most likely.
Okay. By the way, Fong, in this new system, we have people sometimes ask questions in the question and answer session. Did you see that?
Yeah, Caroline asked her a question.
Okay, you take those.
Yeah, what is mode 4 with regards, now we are talking about India, what is mode 4?
What is it? Okay, so it's part of trade-in services, and it's about the temporary supply of service suppliers across borders. So it's people being moved across borders to supply services. It's temporary, but temporary is not defined, and it's without numerical limits or quotas. So it could be very significant numbers.
Okay.
And she has another question. She would like to hear more about Theresa May's husband.
Like what sort of thing does she want to know?
I think that I have the same question.
Does he shave every day? Does he?
No, about the money that you mentioned before.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. I didn't say it was his money. I said that the firm.
No, that he is CEO or something. Yeah.
Handles big money. I think he's on TV at the moment, actually. So I've told you about all I know about Theresa May's husband, but I think it's the people in this country do not realise the extent to which the City of London, which is not in any sense London or British, it's transnational capital with a basis in London, but people don't realise the extent to which the City of London dominates UK domestic policy making and UK policy making in regard to the rest of the world. So, for instance, we have to be the most liberalised country in the universe because that's what the City of London wants us to be the model for. So we have to take it into account much more than it usually is taken into account, and it drives policy, particularly UK trade negotiation policy. Is really driven from the City of London. I just thought it was worth pointing out that Theresa May's husband has a significant job in a significant firm in the city.
Okay, well, you're very good there. We mustn't libel ourselves, so we have to be careful. Yeah, one of the problems, though, is I guess, you know, if we're outside the EU and we're a single country trying to negotiate trade deals, if you're negotiating with a country like China, I mean, all the advantages are with them. I mean, their corporate structure and their government is so interlinked, even much more than ours. They have the same interests, and the power that we will have when negotiating with them would be negligible, as so many other countries have found, even the United States.
What are you asking me?
Well, I'm asking, I'm sort of making a comment that how do we get over that? I mean, you know,
well,
we're trying
this
to.
is where you have to be really, not just go with this magic word trade deals, but actually look really at what's in it. What are any of the trade-offs that are being asked for? What are the gains, and what are what you're giving up? You really have to look carefully and not just accept the magic word trade deal, which is the level the media is operating on at the moment. You know, just the magic word trade deal. I mean,
Well,
you don't need a trade deal to trade.
No.
The trade deal sets the terms, but it doesn't mean you don't trade without a trade deal.
So in your view, sort of a general question outside, should we actually go into the new world we're in without trade deals? Is that a better option?
I think we need to explore what's possible, what's on offer, and that it has to be public, and it has to be publicly discussed, and it has to be recognized. There are always winners and losers, and we have to acknowledge who's going to lose, who's going to win, and not this sort of trickle down mythology that it's going to be good for everyone, because the losses can be very significant for some people. So it's just having some real information and public debate about them. I mean, the whole trade agreement thing has been so secretive in the EU and in this country, nothing at all here in this country, nothing at all about the trade agreements that we've been part of as part of the EU. I mean, it was handled by the Department BIS, Business Innovation and Skills, but now it's the new Department of International Trade. But they are just so reluctant to give out any information. It should not be like that. This is our country, our world, our economy, our lives, and we need the information about it, and we need to be able to debate it, and our parliamentarians need to be able to debate it. This is what's lacking, the information.
Okay, I mean, so you actually said, you know, two interesting things, that, you know, we should always try to find out, first of all, who benefits, and secondly, we should try and find out whether there is any overall benefit, that sometimes there's no benefit for people at all except the big powers, and it's actually scrutinizing that. And I mean, I think that's pretty good advice. So is your view that now we're out of the EU and we're desperately looking around for trade deals, that we're actually in a very vulnerable position, that we may actually make the sort of deals that we might not have had we thought about it because of the desperation of the situation? And is this a time for us to actually organize a lot more and be a lot more careful?
Yeah, I'd leave out the desperate. I think it's worth noting that we will be very much the minor party with the US, and so we could be told that we have to make huge compromises for a deal with the US. But this is again where you need the information and an initial assessment of what gains and what losses and for whom. That's an important part, for whom, I think.
I have a
Okay.
question.
Okay.
Before you were talking about education from your slides. Is it the education about trade deal that you are referring to?
Yes, I meant it in the sense that not just accepting this magic word trade agreement, but educating people of the dangers, for instance, about the food situation, the dangers of about ISDS. So the people, I guess I'd call it trade literate,
Yeah.
having some literacy in these issues.
Yeah, so who should be responsible for informing people what we are doing or what the government is doing?
Who should be responsible? Who is? I think it's the government that should be responsible, and the department should be responsible. But I wouldn't hold your breath on that one. So I guess it's up to. It comes down to a people-to-people stuff.
Sorry, so the information that you have today, is it? Can everyone access it, or only few people like you can access it?
I've been in a sort of email loop with, I suppose, mostly with EU NGOs who are, especially in Brussels, are often in a position to get information and pass it round. Some of it's reported information from the press, but this could, with Brexit, this could come much more, and I'm sort of feeling that way now, and that it will be much more like this, that it will come back to here, the information here. So it's about digging for information here and sharing what information you do have here.
Because I think the problem is that the internet today, you can put in Brexit and you get a lot out from Google. And it's information, but what kind of information is it that we want? And there may be wrong information on the internet.
I can't deal with wrong information. I can see that if you Googled Brexit, you'd get a million things. I guess with a new government, people need to be onto their MPs.
Okay, I mean, we're getting close to the end, but some of the things you just said now, as you said earlier, I think are quite worth sort of re-emphasizing in terms of what we can do. And maybe you could add to this when I just go through them. I mean, first of all, I guess you think we should support Gareth Davis and his bill to make sure that Parliament can scrutinise. And that's a very big issue. And in fact, he did a meeting with us, if you remember, in the House of Commons on this. In fact, I've learned more about trade deals on this webinar than I did in the House of Commons meeting. So that's been really good. So, supporting the move by Geraint and others to make sure that Parliament...
Let's hope he's back in.
Let's hope he's back in. There are one or two problems in Wales, yeah. The other is to create a network of people who are interested in finding them and trying to get them to work together. Thirdly, it's actually providing the sort of education, and Fong was asking questions about that, like where do we get the right information? How do we get the right sort of education as well on trade deals? And finally, which is very interesting, because you haven't said what they are yet, but maybe they're in the process of being drafted, and that's the red lines. Because I think it would help a lot of people if there were those red lines, because they become the litmus paper test against every trade deal that ordinary citizens could then look at. So I think they would be really, really useful.
We have had a version drafted for a while. Further input would be good, but they're probably pretty comprehensive for what's needed. Perhaps I could tell people that there is it's still called a Stop TTIP email list. So it's an email list. There's about 250 people on it, and I post to it mostly. So if anything happens with trade agreements, I send out information like that. I don't see that as a sort of strongly activist network that I was suggesting and hoping will come together at some point. But people can join that Stop TTIP network if they want to be on that for receiving information.
Okay.
So that's a Stop TTIP UK. Stop TTIP at Rise Up. It's a Rise Up address.
Yeah. If you got a chance to type it in when we finish. But yeah. Okay. I mean, is there any other final piece of advice you'd like to give us about how those people who, share the concerns you do, and I hope there are many people who do. I mean, what could they do? I mean, how would you encourage them? Because it's going to be, in the next 2 years, a very difficult and traumatic time.
Watch very carefully and question things and seek information.
Okay, well, I'm sure we will, do more webinars like this and do more work with you as well. So,
if anyone has a commitment to for an ongoing networking to stay on top of this, perhaps they could contact you.
Yeah, or if you wanted to type your email in, but they can contact me and I can put them on to you. So if people do want to get involved in any way and to be in the email loop, please send your interest to me and I'll pass it on to Linda. Okay, Linda, thank you very much for doing this. And it has been, very enlightening. And I'm really glad that Caroline, who's hiding in the question and answer section, actually, I'm glad she recommended you and said that we should do it. And I'm glad we got it together because that was a lot of very, very useful information. So thanks for joining us and for doing it.
Right, thank you.
And thanks, Fong, for joining us as well. Okay, thank you everyone as well for taking part. That was really great, and for your questions. And we hope we'll see you at future webinars.